No, we are in the decade of ecological restoration. It's an incredibly ambitious goal, not only of carbon neutrality, right? That's in the mitigation space, limiting harm. Let's not make things worse. But actually becoming nature positive. This is the idea of moving into a positive reciprocal relationship with the Earth system. This is based off of not just someone's wishful thinking, but a very important group of global researchers who think that this is possible. A really exciting action moving forward. We're not alone when we fight these battles. Often you feel alone. You feel like everything, the wind is blowing against you. That is not true. There are millions of people working on these issues around the world.
Very hard to see. Our next speaker, Dr. Benjamin Abbott. He got his Bachelor of Science from Watershed and Earth System Science from Utah State University, and his doctorate in Biology and Wildlife from the University of Alaska in Fairbanks. He was then a postdoctoral fellow, Marie Curie postdoctoral fellow, and did work in agricultural eco-hydrology as a fellow in Rennes, France. And then followed up with more postdoctoral work at Michigan State University in Arctic eco-hydrology. Ben Abbott developed a passion for science and nature through outdoor experiences. He now researches the permafrost climate feedback and water quality in river networks. His interdisciplinary approach combines should have been ecochemistry, I think, evolutionary biology and social science to understand landscape and ecosystems and co-evolution. Ben is also interested in sustainability, science, communication, and exploring Mormon ecological stewardship. Please welcome Dr. Ben Abbott.
Thank you very much, Scott. And thank you for allowing me to come to meet with you today. I grew up in scouting. I even was a scoutmaster for a while. And the kinds of experiences that people have as youth are absolutely formative in creating that positive relationship with nature. So I'm very grateful for the invitation. I want to talk about some general themes in conservation and environmental stewardship, and then also a very specific issue that we're facing here, stewardship of the Great Salt Lake. And I want to start out with a non-rhetorical question. In your opinion, what is the most important environmental issue? The water? What part of water? Clean water, okay. Having enough water in the right place of the right quality, a global challenge. Climate change, so often described as the defining environmental challenge of our day. Rainforests, loss of habitat, right? Humans have directly modified about 80% of the Earth's land surface. Think about that for a minute. Clean air. So dealing with issues of pollution. Anything else you want to put up on the board? Plastic, solid waste, right? We're not too far from the tipping point where there may be more plastic in the ocean than fish, for example. Okay, these are all important issues. Thank you. And I really agree. If you were to ask me what are the most important environmental issues, I'd put these four up there. Harm to human well-being from environmental pollution, the decline of life on Earth, so thinking about loss of habitat, disruption of the Earth's great biogeochemical sciences. Scott, it wasn't a typo, biogeochemical. But we have changed, we've more than doubled the amount of reactive nitrogen in the Earth system. And then finally, climate change. And I want to make a distinction here. I mainly care about 3 and 4 because of their impact on 1 and 2, right? My values are actually with people and with other life on Earth. It's what makes our planet unique from a secular perspective. And from a religious or moral perspective, we've been commanded by God to love one another and care for His creations. So Venus has a climate as well that's really messed up, by the way, but there aren't the same moral implications for that. When we disrupt climate, it's affecting the food system global droughts. It's affecting our ability to have a stable climate that we need. This harm to human well-being from environmental pollution, I think I'm going to spend a minute on this one, because air pollution did come up, but for many of us, it feels kind of like an environmental issue from a few decades ago, right? Didn't we fix that in the 70s? There was the Clean Air Act, the Clean Water Act. We really made a lot of progress on that. We have, right? Air pollution in the US has decreased. If we look globally, however, environmental pollution remains the single largest preventable cause of human death on the planet. So this is you may not be able to read this, it's from a paper published in 2020 by Isabella Arrigo. Environmental pollution causes 15 million premature deaths every year. That's 15 million deaths that wouldn't have occurred in that year. So if we put this in context, it's more than all communicable disease and nutritional disorders combined. That's both under and over nutrition. So malaria, tuberculosis, malnutrition globally. Environmental pollution is a larger humanitarian issue than all of those things added together. It doesn't mean that we should stop dealing with those issues. Very important, clearly. But this isn't at the top of most people's minds when they wake up in the morning, right? We're thinking about violent conflicts worldwide. Environmental pollution kills 10 times more people than all of the war, murder, and even suicide globally. Not to minimize how important dealing with those issues is. So if I were to ask you, what are the most important causes of these problems, how would you respond? Okay, so they're caused by human mismanagement, intervention, or not taking care of the resources that we have. Yeah. Lack of infrastructure, right? So has anybody seen the TV series The Simpsons? There are very few Mr. Burns out there who are thinking, ha ha ha, how am I going to destroy the environment? Most of the time, people want to make the right decision, and the infrastructure often isn't there to help with it. Yeah.
Overpopulation.
So overpopulation. Are there too many people in the Earth system? Right, in the 1970s, if we looked at the population bomb hypothesis, right, we thought that maybe 2 or 3 billion people was the carrying capacity of the Earth. Now we're well past that.
What about greed?
Interesting. So here, not a physical dimension of the Earth system, but an absolutely important view of what's going on. And if we let's contrast these two ideas. Overpopulation is the idea that there are too many people. Greed, for me, emphasizes overconsumption. That a few of the people are consuming not what they need to meet their, to have a dignified life, but many, many times more that. In fact, if we look, it's really interesting. If you look at where the majority of climate emissions are coming from, the top 1% of producers, so the top 1 richest percent of people on the planet, are producing more emissions than the bottom 60%. So the poorest 60% of people on Earth are not producing as much altogether as the top 1%. So I actually fall more on this side. This isn't an issue of overpopulation. It's an issue of overconsumption. Now, the ultimate, if we're thinking mathematically, the impact on the Earth system is the product. You multiply those two things together, the average consumption per capita and the number of people on the planet. But if we were to live within our means, then there is enough and to spare. Then we could provide for all of the people in the Earth system and still leave room for the other life that's here. Any other thoughts on what are the factors driving these environmental problems? Ignorance and apathy. So 2 more human emotions or approaches. Industrial impacts, right? So each time that we drink a Coke, not to pick on you, or it looks like a Dr. Pepper, so it's just theoretical, right? There's a whole impact upstream of that. Where was it manufactured? And then there's the downstream impact. Where is it going to go? We're a part of an industrialized world. For better and for worse, right? Sometimes we forget why we did these things. Again, this isn't a situation where there's Mr. Burns trying to do bad things. But we've got to look at the entire life cycle of the choices that we're making. Yeah?
A lack of
So sometimes, even when we recognize the problem, it isn't clear what we do to solve it. So we don't have all of the tools yet to fix this. I have gotten more and more positive over the last 10 years as I've realized that most of those methods are in place. And now it's a matter of getting organized, building the public understanding and support, and getting them implemented. But not all of the pieces are there. I like to summarize it down to two proximal factors: dirty energy and unsustainable agriculture. These are the two things as a species globally that are causing most of these problems. But I really agree with those of you making comments about what is going on in the individual people and then us as a community. And I think that both of these are symptoms of a loss of proper relationship with each other, the whole human family, and with our home, with the earth. Right? We wouldn't choose to be doing these things, or we wouldn't tolerate to continue doing these things as we learn about the negative consequences, unless somehow we hadn't become disconnected from one another. And this is not my idea. If we go back, Barry Commoner is sometimes described as the most important ecologist of the 20th century. And I'm going to read this quote. He says, "When any environmental issue is pursued to its origins, it reveals an inescapable truth, that the root cause of the crisis is not to be found in how men interact with nature, but in how they interact with each other. That to solve the environmental crisis, we must solve the problems of poverty, racial injustice, and war." So again, sometimes we're viewing people and nature as two separate things. And what we have learned again and again and again is that we are a part of the ecosystem. If we degrade the earth around us, if we pollute our water and air and soil, if we cut down the forests, if we degrade the grasslands, that comes back and impacts us. Not in some many, many years from now way. Right? Again, think back to that data on environmental pollution. In that same study, Arrigo et al. Found that the average Utahn loses between 2 and 5 years off their healthy lifespan because of exposure to air pollution. And Utah is actually cleaner than the average state in the United States. I was taught this kind of conceptual model. It sometimes is called the sustainable development model. Right? We're looking at where there's overlap between economic, environmental, and societal needs. But I actually now call it the competitive interests model. And I think in some ways it's profoundly counterproductive and even misleading. Because, for example, let's see, how can I do this? Maybe you're not going to be able to see. Yeah, it implies that there are parts of human society, for example, that exist outside of the environment. And even if you're Jeff Bezos and you can take your rocket out into the sky for just a minute, it all is connected back to the Earth system. And so I like this ecological view that's been proposed, where we recognize that every part of human society exists and occurs within the Earth system, and the economy is just part of what we're trying to do as a species. It's important, right? We absolutely need jobs. We need ways of meeting our needs. I'm not dismissing that. But if there's a conflict, if we're starting to ask questions about short-term economic benefit versus long-term planetary stability, this hierarchical or nested model is really helpful there. And thankfully, it's being integrated more and more. This One Health concept that you may have heard of has been adopted by health departments around the country and around the world, recognizing that human health, animal health, and ecosystem health are actually part of the same thing. COVID-19 is an example, right? A zoonotic disease coming from wildlife that then impacted humans at a global scale. There also is really interesting community leadership and religious leadership on this topic. This is Wangari Maathai, who won the Nobel Prize and in the Nobel Peace Prize for her environmental work, restoring forests in sub-Saharan Africa. And I love how she recognizes this two-way connection, not only in the negative dimensions, right? We've talked about the negative environmental problems that emerge when we have an improper relationship with the earth, but she emphasizes the positive things that can come as we heal that relationship. So she says, we are called to assist the earth, to heal her wounds, and in the process heal our own. Indeed, to embrace the whole creation in all its diversity, beauty, and wonder. This will happen if we see the need to revive our sense of belonging to a larger family of life. Isn't that beautiful? It kind of gives me the shivers, to be honest. It really resonates. As you've worked with young people, I wasn't planning on doing this poll, but I really am interested to know. If we were to, many of you have years or decades of experience working with young people. If you were to make an assessment about, is their mental health and well-being getting better, staying the same, or getting worse, where would you put that? Who says that it's getting better through time? Who says that it's staying the same? Who says that it's getting worse? Unanimous. And the data back this up. I have 4 children from 5 to 15 years old, and it keeps me up at night. Right? When we think of the entire environment that they're living in, what are they facing? What are the challenges? What are the support systems that they have? And I feel that part of the solution is here. As they reconnect with the earth, as they re-envision themselves as a positive force, not just a negative human impact, but they can make a difference in their communities. They can learn about and respect and emulate the earth system around them. I believe that that's a part of what we're losing as we spend more of our time in a virtual environment, disassociated from one another and the life around us. We need to understand our belonging to this larger family of life. Pope Francis in 2015 summarized it so beautifully, I think. God shows us just how inseparable the bond is between concern for nature, justice for the poor, commitment to society, and interior peace. Isn't that beautiful? All of these things are connected. And think about how we feel when we fall into a place of greed, when we try to find meaning through buying the next iPhone, right? Getting an upgraded watch, getting, what's the car, the Cybertruck, right? That's where true happiness comes from, right? No, that is a path that leads to emptiness. Versus instead, when we're thinking about connection with one another, about service, about the values that we learn, honestly, through scouting and so many civic groups. The presiding bishop from my religion, Gerald Cosset, just a few years ago mentioned this. He said, "The care of the earth and of our natural environment is a sacred responsibility entrusted to us by God, which should fill us with a deep sense of duty and humility. It is also an integral component of our discipleship." So taking down these boundaries, right? I think that in earth stewardship, environmentalism, that has a lot of political baggage around it for many people, right? And we need leaders from across the political spectrum to be saying, here's what it looks like for an evangelical Christian. Here's what it looks like for an atheist. Here's what it looks like in a group like the Boy Scouts that bridges people, participants from that whole spectrum. Let's turn now and apply these principles to this specific issue, to Great Salt Lake. This is a picture from the International Space Station that shows the Great Salt Lake. And let me see, I'm going to try this again. Okay, can you see that little tiny guy? We are right over here, just to the west of the lake, or sorry, to the east of the lake. What do you notice when you look at this picture? And I know it's kind of glary, you might not be able to see. Anything stand out to you? Okay, the lake has 2 colors. It was in the 1950s, a railroad causeway was built across it, and it ended up killing the North Arm because there's no river input into the North Arm. It only gets what seeps through the causeway or goes over a breach that they've put in. So the salinity there rose to around 30%. And the only thing that can survive are these halobacteria that create a purple and pink color. None of the brine shrimp or brine flies that used to be there can survive. So the lake is actually half dead because, again, it was an unintentional change. Nobody expected that to happen. Anything else that you notice, either about the lake or its watershed? Okay, it's a lot smaller. In fact, it's about 2/3 smaller than it used to be. So it used to be the largest saline lake in the Western Hemisphere. Now it comes in around number 2. Mar Chiquita in Argentina is beating it. And this is why, I don't mean to get political, but we need to make Great Salt Lake great again, right? Like this is our rallying cry from whatever side you're on. So this is the time series. If we look, it's actually from the year that I was born, 1984, until today, we can see this disappearing act. And the stats are that we've lost about 60% of the surface area of the lake, about 3/4 of the lake's water volume. And remember how the North Arm got too salty that it killed the food web? We are within 5 years or sooner of that happening. In 2022, we were a percentage or two of salinity away from that happening. The food chain began to collapse. So a non-rhetorical question again, what is the largest cause of the decline? This is the first quiz of the night. So I'm going to go through these 5 options. Just raise your hand. Who thinks it's irrigated agriculture? Who thinks it's urban expansion? Who thinks it's climate change? Who thinks it's drought? Who thinks it's fracking, hydrologic fracturing? Okay, the number 1 driver is irrigated agriculture. That accounts for around 80% of the lake's decline. Climate change and drought account for the remaining 20%. One of the interesting things, this gets back to some of us not living within our means. The population of Utah has more than doubled since 1984, but the urban water consumption has stayed flat. It hasn't increased. That population has grown in a water neutral way. Now we need to grow in a water negative way, right? Consuming even less because the population of Utah will continue to increase in the foreseeable future. Here is the pie chart that kind of shows the breakdown. And I group reservoir loss with agricultural water use primarily because that's why we're storing and diverting so much water. But it's this 80-10-10 pie. 80% agriculture, 10% mineral extraction, 10% cities and industry. If we ask how much more water does Great Salt Lake need to begin its restoration, it's a big number. We use acre feet. An acre foot is about 1/3 of a million gallons. And so there's a sure telltale sign. If you hear anybody saying, this is going to save 1 million gallons of water, whenever it's expressed in gallons, you know it's an insignificant amount of water, right? It doesn't mean anything. We're talking about huge amounts of water. It's about a cubic kilometer more of water a year that we need. 1 million acre feet. This means that we have to decrease consumptive human water use in the watershed by 1/3 to 1/2. And I hope that conveys kind of the gravity of the situation. We're not talking about taking shorter showers here. We're talking about a fundamental change in our relationship with water on an extremely short time frame. Right? We don't have 50 years to do this. Did I see a question?
Okay, where is all the water in the lake going to that's disappearing?
Yeah, so this is a great question. It's only the mineral extraction wedge that's coming directly from the lake. And I'll talk about I'll show a picture in a minute. All of the other water use is happening in the river network before it gets to the lake. So these saline lakes depend on fresh water to stay alive. A freshwater river, just like the one that comes out of this canyon, eventually, if it weren't diverted, would make it to the lake and help keep that level high. Because we've diverted it, there's a little bit less water, and so the lake is losing water like it always has through evaporation, but it has less coming in, so the water level goes down. Does that make sense?
Yeah, are you going to cover where the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints recently turned over tons of water
Yeah.
showers?
So the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints last year announced the donation of 20,000 acre feet of water, by far the largest donation that's ever been made to Great Salt Lake in perpetuity. So for the first time, at least since European settlers got here, the lake actually has water rights. Now, 20,000 acre feet is a huge amount of water, and it's what percentage of what we need? Any good math whizzes in here? 20,000 and 1 million? It's about 2%. Now, some people laughed and said, I can't believe this, right? And I think that that's very counterproductive. Anybody who's giving 2% of what we need, we only need 50 donors of that size to get where we need to go, right? It's actually a pretty significant drop, but it is still a drop in the bucket. If we look overall at how much we've done so far, this is a number that unfortunately the state legislature does not want to admit. There was a proposed bill last session saying, let's look at how far along we are toward this 1 million acre feet, and it got voted down. And I understand why, right? That's a politically hard situation to be in, to admit, we're probably only 10% of the way there when we add all of the changes that have been done up.
You can have Utah Lake.
Yeah, so I got sued over Utah Lake, so we aren't going to go there. The lawsuit was thrown out as an illegal anti-free speech lawsuit, but that's another story for another day. There was a company that wanted to build the world's largest artificial islands right inside of Utah Lake, and I unfortunately fortunately, I criticized that project from a scientific basis, and they did not appreciate that, so they sued me. But that was the beginning and the end of the project. So when you've got a problem, it's good to look for examples elsewhere. Who has solved this in other places? And Great Salt Lake actually is not a weird water body. About half of the Earth's lake water is stored in these saline lakes. This is the largest saline lake in the world. Anybody recognize? It's not in our neck of the woods. What is this water body? The Caspian Sea. So half of the world's lake water is in these terminal basins that don't drain to the ocean. So they slowly accumulate salt. Unfortunately, of the world's 120 large saline lakes, nearly all of them are in decline. So if we look around, there are time series like this on every continent except for Antarctica. And it's the same story. These lakes are very hydrologically sensitive, and they only occur in arid or semi-arid ecosystems where people have more water needs, right? If you're growing corn in Iowa, you don't irrigate the corn. There's plenty of precipitation for that to grow on its own. If you're trying to grow wheat or corn or alfalfa, our biggest crop here, it only grows with irrigation, right? So the human water needs are greater, and the resources in these regions are fewer when we're thinking about water. And anybody remember how much of Great Salt Lake have we lost? Area-wise? Yeah, 2/3, around 60%. It turns out Great Salt Lake is representative of the global picture. Each dot represents a different saline lake. We've lost 60% of the global saline lake area. So again, people are going to blame Utah and say, oh, it's just crazy mismanagement. Actually, we're average. It's a C. Now, that's not an excuse, right? The consequences of losing the lake are going to be just as bad if they're happening elsewhere as here. And in fact, that's what I want to talk about less. Which of these things is not a consequence of the loss of saline lakes globally? Because I've been asked a question a lot. In fact, I used to get this a lot. Why do we even care? Great Salt Lake is a salty, muddy, shallow, even stinky water body. Why should we care? So which of these has not been caused by the decline of saline lakes? A, the rebound of the Earth's crust. So raise your hand when you think it's the wrong one. 2, increase in global sea level. 3, change in the tilt of the Earth. Okay, a few hands. D, destruction of agriculture. That's an interesting one, right? Because agriculture is causing the declines of the lake, so how could they come back? E, degradation of public health. Okay? And F, extinction of bird, fish, mammal, and plant species. This is the only trick question, because all of these are being caused by the global decline of saline lakes. Now, some of them are just kind of gee whiz things, right? The rebound of the Earth's crust. As we have this is a study that came out just a few years ago. As we've lost so much water from Great Salt Lake, remember the crust is floating in the mantle. And so there is a measurable rebound and there are micro-earthquakes that have been caused because of that. That's happened even in greater extent in places like the Aral Sea, right, where the whole lake system was lost. The change in the tilt of the Earth, that one's just kind of, okay, gee whiz, we've redistributed some water. Increase in global sea level is actually very important. And the decline of these saline lakes is the second largest contributor to global sea level rise after the loss of ice. But if I were to summarize the 3 reasons why I care, again, think back to our environmental values. People, other life on Earth, human health. This is a picture on the right of Salt Lake City being engulfed in a dust storm coming off of Great Salt Lake. We have 800 square miles of exposed lake bed. And through time, that sediment has accumulated a bunch of things we don't want in our body. Metals and metalloids like arsenic and mercury, cyanotoxins from some of the cyanobacteria that live in the lake. When there's water there, they're safely held in the sediment. When there's not water there, they can become airborne. They can be deposited on crops. That's this connection with agriculture. On the left is a picture of Mar Chiquita in Argentina and a 600-mile dust plume that's being blown from the exposed lake. And there's enough salt being transported that it's actually causing sodification of the soil. So it's decreasing the soil fertility of that agricultural activity. And then on the right shows the devastation of the economy that can happen. This is the Aral Sea, where entire cultures have been lost. And if we look at the public health implications, they are truly sobering. So this is at the current boundary of Uzbekistan and Kazakhstan. There had to be public health notices to mothers to not nurse their children because the concentrations of these heavy metals in their tissues and in their breast milk were too high to be healthy. So again, there's no separation between the health of our environment and the health of our bodies and our communities. We simply have to take care of our home. The dust gets deposited on snow. This is what our snowpack is supposed to look like. In 2022, when the lake reached its all-time low, this is what it actually looked like. You may not be able to see, but that dust gets deposited on the snow. It darkens the snow, so that pollutes the water source, but it also makes it absorb more sunlight. And so the snow melts faster. In that year, it's estimated that the snowpack melted 17 days earlier than it would have without the dust. So imagine if you're a farmer trying to irrigate your fields and the rivers go dry 17 days early, right? That's the difference between being able to get the potatoes out of the ground or not. Imagine if you're a city that's trying to meet demand and your water supply stops. It makes it way harder and photogenic to ski on. Think of save the selfies, you know? So the Great Salt Lake accounts for between 5 and 15% of the powder that Utah is famous for. There's a reason why all of the destination ski resorts are downwind of Great Salt Lake. There's a new study that finds that 50% of the rain and snow within the Salt Lake Valley comes from Great Salt Lake. So the reason why we live in this amazing urban forest rather than like the West Desert, anybody been out to the Salt Flats? It's amazing out there, it's really beautiful. It's less pleasant to live out there, right? It doesn't have that source of water vapor. So this isn't about saving some ecosystem because we care about it for some reason. This is about our way of life. And ultimately, I think it's about our values. Who are we as a people? Do we have the foresight? Do we have the forbearance? Do we have the planning? Do we have the discipline to save this lake? And are we going to be the first? Because there are no examples of these lakes, once they slip into decline, being restored. Our batting average is 0. Nobody has figured this out. Some people bring up Mono Lake in California. I was there this summer. They have successfully slowed and potentially stopped the decline, but they are still 14 feet below the mandated healthy level for the lake. That second reason is biodiversity. Right? There are over 400 bird species that depend on the lake, 12 million migratory birds. If we lose the lake, we lose a crucial link in the Pacific Flyway. And the ecological implications will be felt from Patagonia to Prudhoe Bay, all throughout the Western Hemisphere. Water use, this is an evaporation pond that's used to concentrate salts. The thing that all of these products have in common is they've got a little bit of Great Salt Lake in them. Everything from stone fruits and nuts grown in California, they depend on potash fertilizer that's taken from Great Salt Lake. Great Salt Lake is the only source of magnesium in the country. This is essential to all of our electronics, aerospace industry, defense. Every aluminum and titanium alloy has magnesium in it. Our pop cans. So again, for all of the reasons we've got to protect the lake. And the poor track record has led some people to ask, are terminal lakes that don't drain to the ocean, are they terminal? Do we just need to acknowledge that they're not compatible with human habitation? And I have not accepted that. I think that the answer is no. Everything is impossible until it isn't. Nobody had flown in the air until the Wright brothers did it. Right? Nobody had gotten to the moon until the US did it. And that's why we're committed to be the first. And this is much more a problem or an opportunity that involves the kinds of things that you do, teaching environmental values, than it is a scientific problem. This is a simple scientific problem. The lake's not getting enough water. Right? We need to implement solutions so that we use less water. And I love this, this verse in 2 Timothy. For God hath not given us the spirit of fear, but of power and of love and of a sound mind. And if we take this positive view and say, okay, what can we do? This is a challenge, but can we be pioneers? Then I think the question becomes, how can we grow the flow to Great Salt Lake by 1 million acre-feet in time? And this is a snowy plover, so an endangered species that depends on Great Salt Lake. And it's just a tiny little chick trying to capture these brine flies that the birds eat. And it fails most of the time. But look at how fast it's running. Right? Because it has to succeed or it dies. And that's kind of dark, but I actually feel some comfort in that. We have to succeed, or ultimately our way of life is threatened. So how do we establish water security? I won't read you the boring UN definition of what water security is, but I will show you an exciting mathematical formula. Water security is when supply is greater than demand. Simple. The alligator eats the bigger side, right? So when supply is greater than demand, we have water security. But there's another way of formulating this same mathematical equation that I think is important. Because when you look at it this way, what's the solution to water security? Increased supply, right? It's pretty obvious. And that is where we, the people of Utah, have been focused. Here's a list of 7 proposals. Let's build a pipeline from the Pacific Ocean. We'll bring in more water. Who cares that it's going to cost $40 billion and take 50 years? And then we'll have to use about 1/3 of our total electricity to run the pump station on it. Who cares? We'll increase supply. Maybe we could cut down all of the trees in the watershed. This is a real proposal that's being piloted. Because trees, quote, use water. It's probably nature's fault. And this is some of the rhetoric. Nature, quote, uses over 90% of the water to begin with. Right? Greedy nature. So let's change nature so that there's more runoff. There's been an idea to use nuclear reactors to desalinate groundwater. There's another idea to build these islands in Utah Lake or do cloud seeding. I'm not a prophet, but I feel very confident telling you none of these are going to work. None of them are going to, and this is one of the examples that we've learned from around the world with these lakes. Increasing supply does not lead to water security. The same way that if you've got a spendthrift teenager who's trying to balance their budget, and you say, oh, yeah, I'll help you. I'll just double your allowance. Is that going to lead to financial security for them? No, the spending's going to increase. So let's spin around. It's exactly the same equation, but now we start looking at demand. When demand is less than supply, then we have water security. And again, Rhett Larson has a fabulous book. He's a water lawyer from Arizona. And he has a 3-step plan for water security. Understand water. Figure out how much is sustainably available. Right? Those of you who are familiar with the Colorado River, one of the problems was we had an improper baseline. Right? We started off over allocating the water. We gave it to all of the states. There never was that much water in the river. So you're setting yourself up for failure. Understand water. Study it. Number 2, conserve the heck out of it. Do everything you can to eliminate waste. And then number 3, after you've absolutely tapped out every conservation measure you can do, then consider augmenting water, bringing in supply. And the reason why he frames it this way is the things at the top of the list are preventative, they're scalable, they have co-benefits, right? If we figure out how to grow food with less water, that means when there's a drought, farmers aren't hit as hard. There is no downside. If instead we're saying we're going to buy water from Idaho and build a pipeline in from the Snake River, anybody from Idaho here? So you've got tons of extra water in Idaho, right? Idaho literally gave notice just a few weeks ago and shut off all groundwater pumping, in the lower Snake Valley because the situation was so dire there with groundwater being depleted. On the other hand, if you're counting on growing the supply, these things are reactive. They cost a heck of a lot more. Think of that pipeline. They're counterproductive and they often have trade-offs. Now, there's a parallel in ecological restoration that I think is really beautiful. This is a paper by Palmer and Stewart. When we're thinking of how should we interact with habitat, sometimes we think about mitigation. Now, mitigation is better than nothing, but actually conservation is the best. What do we have that's intact? What parts of nature still are functioning well, including with people there, right? I'm not only talking about pristine areas that people haven't gone to, because those areas basically don't exist anymore. But what can we conserve? What can we protect? And as we're over on the conservation side, this takes less effort and it's more likely to succeed. If we're over on the mitigation side where we say, okay, we destroyed some wetlands around Great Salt Lake, but we're going to create some artificial wetlands around Bear Lake. That costs a lot of money. It doesn't provide the same ecological value that those high-quality natural wetlands did. And what's interesting to me is, on the left side, we're focused on changing society. On the right side, we're still living in this fantasy world of somehow we can change nature. We can change the rules of nature. And so again, it comes back to what you're doing, changing hearts and minds. So we know what we need to do with Great Salt Lake. We know what we need to do for many of these environmental issues. Now it's a matter of building the trust, of working together to actually get it done. And I think I'm going to end with just 2 slides. I used to think that this is how science communication and translation worked. We would generate some evidence. We'd understand the system better. We'd tell policymakers, they would implement policies, and then this would lead to progress. And we really thought this would work on Utah Lake, on Great Salt Lake. Instead, we found it's a lot more complicated, right? And this is a little bit more detailed model, but what I really like is the things at the top of the pyramid, they're nice. But they are kind of things that emerge from the bottom. What matters most is our values and our culture. Are we creating a culture that recognizes the need to respect one another, to respect the earth around us? When our youth, who become our leaders, have those values, the right policies are inevitable, right? They may take time to figure out all the details, but they will follow. Versus you can ram a policy through, maybe it's going to be effective for a little while, maybe it's going to trickle down and influence culture, but that's actually a pretty fragile way to solve these problems. So with that, I will say thank you very much and open it up. I don't know if we have time for a question or two. Okay, Scott says yes. So thank you. And if you want to learn more about Great Salt Lake, we have a movement called Grow the Flow, nonpartisan, nonprofit that's being led primarily by youth leaders. There are student chapters, including high schools. We haven't partnered with the Scout. What's it called now? Thank you. We haven't partnered yet with Scouting America, but that would be really interesting, right? If there is a troop, if there's a group of troops that would like to start a chapter or start working on some of these things, we would love that. Yeah.
So how does your studies with permafrost and the Arctic and all that relate to what we're talking about here?
Yeah, so the question was, how does my work like in Alaska and Siberia relate to what's going on here? They're totally different and exactly the same. So the same factors are influencing what's happening there as what's going on here. So I still do a lot of work up in the Arctic, but it's not directly connected. Yeah.
I understand almost everything except for how the decline of the saline lakes increases ocean.
Yeah. So the question was, how is the decline of saline lakes increasing ocean levels? So think back, we divert the rivers flowing to these lakes. We put them out primarily on agricultural fields. For the Aral Sea, it was alfalfa, cotton, and melons. This was kind of during the collapse of the Soviet Union. And so think about, you divert all that water, where does it go? So some of it goes back into the ground and will eventually make it back to the lake, but a lot of it is evapotranspired. It goes up into the air. And then it blows out of the watershed, rains or snows out downwind, and then that water ends up flowing to the ocean in a watershed that actually drains to the ocean. And so it's that atmospheric route through time. And if you look at all of the lakes around the world, we're sending 66 cubic miles of water from these lake systems up into the air and then out toward the ocean eventually. So imagine driving your car, running, riding your bike, whatever your form of transportation is, 66 miles, and then imagine a cube of water going up that distance and across that distance. It's enormous.
No other questions? Last call?
Yeah.
Not to say is there a bad guy, but
Yeah.
Is there a particular, I don't know, institution or, I mean, can't say farmers, but that is most in opposition to some
Yeah.
of the solutions proposed?
Yeah, great question. So who isn't in favor of saving Great Salt Lake, right? Like, I mean, let's help the children. Who's going to say, no, I don't want to help the children? The reason why it's so hard is Western water law gives very, very strong rights and, in fact, entitlements to those who claimed the water first. It's not truly those who were here first, right? The indigenous peoples of the watershed were here thousands of years before Europeans came and said, okay, we'll write some laws and claim all of the water. But there's this doctrine of prior appropriation. So if I'm a farmer and I'm using water to grow alfalfa, and I conserve some of that water, I could, out of the goodness of my heart, donate it, or I could use it to grow more crops. And right now, there's a lack of trust. There is a state program that will buy that water from them, either short-term or long-term, but farmers aren't participating because they're skeptical. They're worried that they're going to lose their right. There's an existential threat there. They feel like the cities are coming for our water. People have figured out that we're using all of the water. And so the water conservancy districts don't want change because their business model kind of depends on the status quo. Much of the legislature, which has a strong rural bias, is protecting the interests of some of their constituents. The farmers have to be on board. If this falls into a fight between farmers and cities, it's going to take way too long to solve. We have to help the farmers realize if we're interested in long-term agriculture in this region, we've got to learn to live within our means. It's a profoundly pro-agricultural message. Yeah.
I mean, was there a specific time period when all of a sudden agriculture exploded?
So great question. The problem is agriculture, it's not like it just doubled or tripled. We've been slowly pushing the lake down for 100 years. So imagine if you show up at a farm and say, you know, we're using too much water, and your parents, and your grandparents, and your great-grandparents were also using too much water, right? It's really hard to say when they see all of the growth in the cities, that's where people's mind goes, you know, as far as that's what must be causing the decline of the lake. Even though we know Great Salt Lake is a huge bank account, right? So we've been overspending it, and it's taken this long to get to the critical point. But it's not that all of a sudden we started using more water. In fact, the peak water use in the watershed was in the 1990s. Since that time, it's stayed the same or slightly come down, here and then here. And you can cut me off anytime, Scott.
The removal of dams,
Yeah.
that's been in the news a lot. How does that play in there?
Yeah, so when the European settlers, my ancestors, the Mormon pioneers, arrived, they didn't have these big, powerful dams and canals. And there's a period for about 100 years where they lived in equilibrium with the lake. They were still diverting some water, but it wasn't nearly as much. In the 20th century, these large federal and state projects building these mega dams were able to divert more than half of the water that was flowing toward the lake. So that allowed people to start appropriating and using a lot more. And that's what signaled the tipping into a deficit for the lake. And so there still are those advocating for building more dams. And they're stuck in that old mindset of if we had more dams, we could store more water and then use it for whatever we want to. In reality, the dams are what are causing the decline of the lake. If we didn't have those dams, when we had the big snow year 2 years ago, that water would have gotten to Great Salt Lake. Instead, where did it go? Into our reservoirs. 1.6 million acre feet of water that would have gotten to the lake instead went to the reservoirs for later human use. Yeah.
Is this presentation going to be available after the conference as well?
I'd be happy to share it. Yeah, for sure. For sure. Yeah, absolutely.
Wasn't the lake level really high during the 80s?
Yeah. So there was a time period, we had a series of really wet years called a pluvial. And that happened because of atmospheric rivers from the Pacific Ocean. As far as we can tell, it was the biggest pluvial in about 1,000 years. And so it could happen again, right? That could give us a little lease on life again, but it's very unlikely. And from my perspective, if we just are waiting on nature to bail us out, that's going to be a pretty tenuous place. It's like, again, balancing a budget. If you're waiting for a windfall profit from your mom sending you a check, that's really nice. But you don't want to be there for more than just a few months in college. Yeah.
Just out of curiosity, how many thousands of years ago was it that Glacial Lake Bonneville drained and created Salt Lake?
Yeah, so 15,000 years ago. It's a pretty young lake geologically. But when we had a wetter climate, it filled all the way up and then busted through what is Red Rock Pass, just north of the Idaho-Utah border. And we now know that there were already indigenous people living around the lake. There also were indigenous people in what we now call the Snake River Valley. So that would not have been a happy day, right? This giant wave coming, it's the second largest flood we're aware of in the history of the Earth system. And then since that time, because of natural climate change, the lake stabilized at around 4,207 feet, and it's been fluctuating around that since that time, until about 100 years ago when we started to drive the decline of the lake.
What is it now?
Now it's 4993. Somebody can fact check that. I think that's the average elevation. Yeah, 4193. Yeah, thank you.
I just want to make a comment.
Yeah.
I did get to talk about a couple of my books. If you didn't see them, on the west side, a lot of this controversy, I guess I'll say, are the books up there. They're great reading, and you probably have heard of them. One is Cadillac Desert,
Yeah.
Drowning the Dream, and then there's one that talks about it around the world, and it's traveling the 38th parallel. They're up on the table. Feel free to take a look at it, take a picture of it. Great reads that explain some of the dynamics leading
Yeah.
to it.
Last question.
The Caspian Sea is. Black Sea actually has an outlet to the ocean, so it's not included in the terminal or endorheic. Oh, yeah, what was the largest? It was some glacial dams that broke out through what is now Oregon. So it was actually in the same time period with this huge North American ice sheet. Yeah, yeah.
So
Thank you very much.
There's a couple of things I want to say real quick. There was a whole curriculum vitae that I decided I wouldn't put on the introduction slide. But there's over 300 publications, peer-reviewed publications, thousands of citations, multiple books. Please take the time to reach out and take a look at Dr. Abbott and some of his work. YouTube is loaded with some wonderful inspirational videos and lots of recorded lectures. So there's plenty of places to get more information. Ben, thank you for being here.
Scott.
We really appreciate having you. This is a little thank you from me.
I really appreciate it.
Our conference chair has a gift for you as well.
Thank you
Dr.
so
Mills.
Such a pleasure.
Dr. Ben Abbott.
Thank you.